Hello. I feel like I've come back to a family reunion. It's great to see so many of you that I haven't seen in a long time. And I'm happy to be up here. I'm going to start. I've got about 20 minutes up here. In the first 10 minutes of it, I'm going to give you a TED Talk that goes live at 10 a.m. this morning on TED.com. I did 3 weeks ago in New York. And then I'm going to talk to you about a social venture that I'm doing now that I feel really strongly about, and I'll just tell you a little bit about that. Part of my goal is to make aging aspirational again. Most of us, as we get older, are like, oh, really? So, all right, so let's start. So it was my third day on the job at a hot Silicon Valley startup in early 2013. I'd been brought into the company because I was a seasoned expert in my field. But in that particular room, I felt like a newbie amongst the tech geniuses. And I did my best to stay invisible because I was surrounded by 12 engineers with an average age of 26. Trying to be invisible, all of a sudden, the wizard, the 25-year-old wizard who was leading the meeting, turned to me and asked, if you shipped a feature and no one used it, did it really ship? Ship a feature? Wow. I realized in that moment, Chip was in deep ship because I had no clue what he was talking about. Mercifully, after a long silence, he moved on to someone else. I slunk down in my chair and I couldn't wait for that meeting to end. That was my introduction to Airbnb 5.5 years ago. I've been actually invited by the three founders, millennial young founders of Airbnb, to join their company to help it move from being a tiny little tech startup and turn it into a global hospitality brand, and also to be the in-house mentor for Brian Chesky, who is one of the co-founders and the CEO. Now, I'd spent from age 26 to 52 being a boutique hotel entrepreneur, so I'd accumulated some hospitality knowledge. But by the end of my first week at Airbnb, I realized that the brave new home sharing world didn't need most of my old school bricks and mortar hotel insights. A stark reality rocked me. What did I have to offer these young people? I'd never worked in a tech company before. I was twice the age of the average person in the company. I was reporting to someone 21 years younger than me, Brian, who was also the person I'm supposed to mentor. 5.5 years ago, I'd never heard of the sharing economy, nor did I have an Uber or Lyft app on my phone. So this was not my natural habitat at all. Now, I could have run for the hills or cast judgment on these young geniuses, but I decided to turn judgment into curiosity and see if I could actually match my wise eyes with their fresh eyes. I fancied myself a modern male Margaret Mead amongst the millennials. So I got curious. And soon, I really learned that I had as much to offer them as they did to me. But as I think more and more back then about the modern workplace, the more I realized that our respective generations often operate like isolationist countries on the same continent. We have different dialects. We have different ways of doing our culture. Sure, we may share a border with each other, but we don't necessarily trust each other enough to share our respective wisdom. As I look at the modern workplace, I realize that maybe the trade agreement of our time, the essential trade agreement of our time, is opening up these pipelines of intergenerational wisdom. It's interesting, today in the US, 40% of us have a boss that's younger than us, and that number is growing very quickly. Power is cascading to the young like never before because of our increasing reliance on DQ, digital intelligence. We see young founders in their early 20s starting companies that actually become global giants before their 30th birthday, but somehow we expect these young digital leaders to miraculously embody the relationship wisdoms we older workers have had decades to learn. It's hard to microwave your relationship skills and emotional intelligence. There's ample evidence that gender and race or ethnically diverse teams are very effective. But what about age? It's a really important question because unintentionally we now have 5 generations in the workplace at the same time. So maybe it's time we got a little bit more intentional about how we brought these generations together. There's been a number of European studies that have shown that age-diverse teams are more effective. And yet, only 8% of companies that have a diversity and inclusion program have actually expanded that program to include age as just as important of a demographic strategy as gender or race. Maybe they didn't get the memo. We're all getting older, as is the world. And there's more and more of a need for us to actually imagine what is our role as we get older. More and more of us need to realize that we aren't just a carton of milk, like an old carton of milk with an expiration date stamped on our wrinkled forehead. We have something to offer. What's interesting, though, is that we have a phrase, 60 is the new 40, and we're usually talking about physically. But when it comes to the workplace today, especially in Silicon Valley where I'm based most of the time, 30 is the new 50 when it comes to power. So how does that make us feel? As you know, we have boomers are getting older, we're more relevant in the workplace longer, and yet we might feel less and less relevant. In fact, if you do the math, if power is moving 10 years younger, and the HBR, Harvard Business Review, had a recent study that showed power has moved 10 years younger in the last 20 years. So if power is moving 10 years younger, and we're all going to live 10 years older, we have created a new societal irrelevancy gap that's 20 years long. Midlife used to be from 45 to 65, and we called it a crisis. Today, I would suggest it's from 35 to 75, because more and more people in their mid-30s are feeling irrelevant, especially in Silicon Valley, but in lots of industries. And many of us are going to work till our mid-70s, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of choice, because we may be living to age 100. So that's depressing on some level, but let me show you the bright side. On the bright side, why is it that we, as we age, we get smarter about our humanity? Our physical peak may be our 20s. Our financial, or at least salary peak, might be around age 50. In Silicon Valley, it's age 45. But our emotional peak is often in midlife and beyond because we have developed pattern recognition about ourselves and others. So how do we help companies actually tap into that valuable midlife wisdom while also nurturing their young digital natives? I think that's a really important question. And I think the most successful companies in the future will actually figure out that intergenerational collaboration. So here's how the alchemy of the generations worked for me at AirBnB. So 5.5 years ago, I joined and became head of global hospitality and strategy. I was in charge of a ton of things in the company: business development, business travel, learning and development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I was assigned a young, really smart leader to join me. Her name is Laura Hughes, and I loved it because Laura used to sit next to me in meetings all the time, and as people were using tech lingo that I didn't understand, I would write down the word, and she became my tech translator. So I was lucky to have her by my side. She was 27 years old when I joined the company. She'd spent 4 years at Google and 1.5 years at Airbnb. And yet, she had moved into management at a very young age without any kind of formal leadership training. I don't care if you're in the B2B business or world, B2C, C2C, or A to Z, business and organizations are fundamentally H to H, human to human. And yet, Laura's whole approach to leadership was technocratic. She'd grown up in the technocratic world, so it was all about numbers, very metric-driven, with business roadmaps and accountability charts. And one of the things she said to me in the early days of when I was her boss is she said, "I appreciate the fact that you've brought our team together, and we as a team came together to determine our vision of where we're going, to create a hospitality department at Airbnb. And we did that as a team, and it became like a compelling North Star for the whole team." She said to me, "Your fact knowledge isn't all that valuable here. We don't necessarily need to know how many rooms does a maid clean in an 8-hour shift in the home sharing world. But your process knowledge is incredibly valuable. As in, how do you get things done around here? Understanding the underlying motivations of everybody sitting at the table. That EQ of yours, Chip, is really valuable. And your organizational savvy about how to get things done in an organizational setting is helpful because most of us in this company, we may know our technology really well, but we've never worked in an organization before. So about a year into Airbnb, Joe Gebbia, one of the co-founders, started calling me a two-word term. And it helped me to see the following. As I spent more time at Airbnb, I realized that a new kind of elder was emerging in the workplace. Not the elder of the past who was regarded with reverence. No, the modern elder is actually striking because of their relevance, not because of their reverence. And that relevance is a function of being curious and realizing that our timeless wisdom is only as good as understanding the setting in which we're putting them. In terms of you have to be as much an intern as you are a mentor. You have to understand things that you didn't understand before. I didn't understand technology. I did not understand the tech world, but I actually had to become an intern when it came to that. So being an intern helped me to see like, wow, here's how I could apply some of my knowledge in a whole new field. So I think it's actually time we start imagining how we value wisdom as much as we do disruption. And I think it's absolutely time that we took back the word elder, but gave it a modern twist. As I said, this modern elder is as much an intern as they are a mentor, because they realize that in a world that's changing as quickly as it is today, that catalytic curiosity that we have is a life-affirming elixir, not just for me, but for everybody around me. We know that intergenerational improvisation is very popular in music and the arts. Think Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga, or Wynton Marsalis and the young stars of jazz. But that kind of riffing off each other's skills can be very vital in the business world as well, especially if we can actually call it something. And the best thing to call it, I think, is mutual mentorship. We're here to actually learn from each other, where we can actually, in my case, I was offering some EQ, some emotional intelligence, and my young millennial friends in the company were offering me some DQ, some digital intelligence. And that was our trade agreement. So over time, I realized as a modern elder, my role in the company was to intern publicly and to mentor privately. And over time, I was surprised by how many people actually approached me. And we were often just mutually mentoring each other. Search engines are brilliant at giving us the answers, but a wise guide can offer you just the right question. And that was part of my role, was to ask a lot of questions. Because one of the things that we think about as we get older is that somehow there's absence. We get more absent, absenting our physical, absenting things that we used to do so well. But the thing that actually someone said to me at Airbnb one day was, what I appreciate about you is not your absence, but your presence. You have presence. You're not just listening to my story, you're listening for my story. You're actually helping me to see threads and themes in my life that I hadn't seen, which brought me to the phrase, knowledge speaks and wisdom listens. And so for those of us in this room who want to actually have a great relationship with younger people, it is absolutely not about preaching to them. It's about listening to them, helping them to hear their story. Over time, I was able to mentor over 100 people in the company. In my 4 years as head of global hospitality and strategy, I've now been for a year and a half the strategic advisor to the founders. But more than anything, what I realized is that Brian brought me in for my industry knowledge because there was not a person in the company with any travel industry background. But what I really offered him and the company was my well-earned wisdom. And I think it's time we retire the phrase knowledge worker, which Peter Drucker came up with in 1959. It's a beautiful word, it made a beautiful term, but I think today we need to renew that because what we really are is wisdom workers. And there's a huge difference between knowledge and wisdom. So I think it's time with 5 generations in the workplace for us to actually cross those intergenerational boundaries, those borders, and find a way to create more of a relationship with each other. Wouldn't it be a delight to learn from people both older and younger than you? And to realize that wisdom, the physics of wisdom, which has historically moved from old to young, can also move from young to old. And that's when it gets most magical. So as you think about your own life, personally, who could you create a mutual mentorship relationship with? And organizationally, how can you create and foster the intergenerational flow of wisdom in your organization? I didn't know what the sharing economy was 5.5 years ago, but today, this is what I think is the new sharing economy, us sharing across generations. So thanks. So more extemporaneously now, I had a fascinating journey. I've had it. And it's part of the reason you haven't seen me in a bunch of years is because I told Brian early on, I'll work 8 hours a week. He said, we want to democratize hospitality, Chip. Will you help us? And we said, it's a 3-legged stool. There's 2 legs in the stool we have. There's 3 of us founders, and between the three of us, we know product or design, and we know engineering. But the 3rd leg of the stool is hospitality. Will you be the 3rd leg of the stool? And I was like, sure. Democratizing hospitality sounds great. And yet, I didn't know a damn thing about what I was getting myself into. And I told Brian I'd give him 8 hours a week. We arm wrestled and said 15 hours a week. And about 3 weeks into it, when he'd given me 6 other departments to oversee, I said, I think you misheard me. This is 15 hours a day. And he looked at me like, dude, this is a tech startup. What do you expect? But let me finish by just talking about something that I feel strongly about. We as a society, so I've spent, all these years, 32 years as a hospitality entrepreneur at Joie de Vivre, second largest boutique hotel company in the US, which I sold to John Pritzker, which he just recently on Monday sold to Hyatt, and then at AirBnB. So I'm now a social entrepreneur, and the thing that I'm really focused on is the following. We as a society have historically created rites of passage, rituals, celebrations for people when they're going through transitional times. So think of puberty, bat mitzvah, bar mitzvah, quinceañera. Think of moving from adolescence to adulthood. You have a graduation ceremony and a commencement. You get married, you have a wedding. You have a baby, you have a baby shower. You die, you have a funeral. But between baby shower and funeral, nada. The truth. I mean, and it's partly because longevity in the United States in 1900 was 47 years old. So midlife was 24. But by the year 2000, it was 77 years old. We added 3 decades of life to the average person in the US in 1 century. By 1965, we had midlife crisis as a term, and 53 years later from 1965, we've done nothing to solve midlife crisis other than to make it longer, going from 35 to 75. What was a crisis is now a marathon. So long story short, as I was writing this book that just came out 3 weeks ago, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, it dawned on me. I was in Mexico. I live in Mexico half the time. I'm sitting on a beach writing, and I'm just like, what if we created a modern elder academy? And realizing that there's a lot of transitions that happen in midlife. You have divorce, you have a spouse die, you have a parent die, you have a disease. We call those organ recitals when we're talking about our diseases. You're like, you're reciting our organs aren't what they used to be. We have changing jobs or careers. We have empty nest syndrome, and empty nesters. We have menopause, men have andropause, and we have nothing societally to support this. So earlier this year, I created something called the Modern Elder Academy, which is a social enterprise on 3 acres of beachfront land in about 1 hour north of Cabo San Lucas in Baja California Sur. And the whole premise is we help people come, and from social workers to investment bankers, because 50% of the people are on full scholarship, and they come and they spend a week together with a group of between 12 and 18 people learning from each other and actually creating a crucible where they actually can be vulnerable enough to say, I'm going to mine my mastery here. I'm going to learn something here. I'm going to learn more about what I've learned. Sometimes we aren't very good in midlife of actually understanding what it is that we've built in terms of our mastery. And then how do you repurpose it somewhere else? So the Modern Elder Academy was open January through June on a beta basis. Beta is a word I learned at tech company. So beta, we did our beta, 6 months of 153 people from 12 countries come together in week-long and 2-week-long programs, and it went phenomenally successfully. So it opens now to the general public on November 4th. First 3 days that we're there, we have a New York Times reporter and a photographer, which is a good sign. We're going to get the word out there. And I believe down to my toes that the idea of creating midlife wisdom schools, which is what Modern Elder Academy is. Modern Elder Academy is the brand. And for those some of you in the branding world think like, you're using elder in your brand? Stupid as shit. That doesn't make any sense. But, bringing back a word this is not the first time it's happened. It used to be bad and derogatory to be a black in the South. And then Malcolm X took back that word. Yankee was a negative word. The dandy Yankees is what the UK, the British called the colonists. Sort of like saying that they weren't very masculine. But then the colonists owned Yankees. Queer was a word that you didn't want to hear in the schoolyard when you were growing up. But today there's a whole queer movement and people own it. So I'm just saying it's time for us to own elder. Because if we're living longer, we're not elderly. Elderly is what happens later in life. But there's a long period of life that's probably between about age 45, 35 in Silicon Valley, and about 75, where you probably are an elder. If you're a 40-year-old surrounded by 25-year-olds, you are an elder. So that's why we've created the Modern Elder Academy, to help people own their elder and to help us all realize that we're all getting older, but only some of us are getting elder. And that's what I want us to learn, is as a society that aging can become aspirational again, not because we're revered, but because we're partners with these young ones. So thank you.